Hey guys, welcome to my video on quantity controls in competitive markets. We got a supply and demand graph, and we're going to imagine a scenario in which the government puts a limit on what quantity the market can provide. We call that a quota. Some examples of quotas include markets with limited numbers of licenses, worker visas, taxi medallions, or kind of anything else. There are lots of markets where the government gets involved and limits the amount of a good that is illegal to be sold. So that happens in lots of scenarios, and I'm sure you can find dozens more. Now, how do we show that on a graph? Well, the way we would do it is we would say that there's some arbitrary quantity that the market's not allowed to cross. And we often just draw a line saying Q cannot exceed this. Now, this is a challenge for our market because the equilibrium quantity, Q star, is usually greater than the quota itself, or else the quota is not going to mean much. This little Q for quota is going to be set as less than Q star. Now, this has a couple of effects in our market. One of them, and hopefully the obvious one that you're recognizing by now, is that that's going to lead to something that we call inefficiency. Remember when we talk about consumer and producer surplus, the maximum willingness to pay is along the demand curve. The minimum willingness to sell is along the supply curve. And as long as willingness to pay is greater than willingness to sell, that's a mutually beneficial transaction. It helps buyer and seller, and so economists like to see it happen. And so we usually like to see any transaction occur where the demand curve is greater than or equal to the supply curve. And in equilibrium, that leads us all the way to this equilibrium point. That's the last point where the willingness to pay is greater than or equal to the willingness to sell. But here's the problem. These transactions, which do benefit buyer and seller, are actually not allowed to occur because those sales exist beyond the quota. That surplus will never be realized. And so if you haven't learned the title for this yet, this is going to lead to something that we call deadweight loss. And deadweight loss is just a measure of the loss of surplus in a market stemming from it being out of equilibrium or reaching some inefficient outcome. Now, there are a couple more things for us to talk about here. At this quantity, the price, the way we usually model it is that the price it's going to sell for is up here. That means that this height is important to us because you see it's a gap between customers' willingness to pay and the cost of producing on the supply curve. Wow, I just realized that I never put a supply label or a demand label. Hopefully you figured that out. Anyway, that wedge between the demand curve and the supply curve, and the fact that we're going to charge at the top end of that wedge means that our suppliers are charging above and beyond their actual cost of production. They're collecting extra money above costs that they would not be able to collect in a competitive market with Q star happening. And so that little wedge called a quota rent. And when economists use the word rent, we're referring to collecting income above and beyond costs, and that's what this is. Quota rent comes from this wedge, this gap between the price people are willing to pay and the actual costs along the supply curve. Because the good is so limited, the price goes up. And for the sellers who are actually selling the good, for the sellers who have the right licenses or the workers who get the right visas or whatever, this quota rent is great because they make a ton of money. The producer surplus in this market is shaded as everything below price and above the supply curve. It's this area, which is bigger than what it would have been because all of this space up here above the equilibrium price used to be consumer surplus. So sellers are gaining at consumer expense from this situation. And then there's your consumer surplus. That's kind of this in a nutshell. In my next couple of videos, I'm going to talk a little bit about taxes, about deadweight loss, and about black markets. Because whenever there are deadweight losses and people willing to buy and sell, it might create some incentives to some illegal transactions. But anyway, that's quantities, controls, and quotas in a nutshell. I hope it's helpful to you. If not, too bad. Thanks for watching, guys. Good luck and happy econing.